Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring the future and future creators. And for all those that like great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador along for the journey. So Compassion in World Farming, or CIWF, is a campaigning and lobbying animal welfare organization which campaigns against live export of animals, certain methods of livestock slaughter, and all systems of factory farming. We're honored today to be joined by Philip Lymbery, who is the Chief Executive Officer of CIWF, as well as a visiting professor at the University of Winchester, an ornithologist, photographer, naturalist, a self-confessed animal advocate, an award-winning author of both Farmageddon, The True Cost of Cheap Meat, which is listed as one of the Times Writers' Books of the Year, as well as The Dead Zone, Where the Wild Things Were. Philip has played leading roles in many major animal welfare reforms, including the Europe-wide ban on veal crates for calves, as well as barren battery cages for laying hens. Described as one of the food industry's most influential people, he has spearheaded CIWF's engagement work with over 800 food companies worldwide, leading to real improvements in lives of more than 1 billion farm animals every year. It was also Philip's vision to set up the world's first Extinction and Livestock Conference, starting in London back in October of 2017, bringing together CIWF and the World Wildlife Fund, supported by His Royal Highness Prince of Wales Charitable Foundation. His awards include the recipient of the Outstanding Campaign by Brussels-based Eurogroup for Animals and the 2015 International Golden Dove Peace Prize in Rome. Philip Lymbery, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today for a little while.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me along.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Philip, I'd like to start off by, as we typically do on this show, by giving you the floor for a little while, just to really introduce yourself. If you can just take us back a little bit to talk about where you grew up, who you are, how you got interested in this area, and a little bit of that to sort of lay the stage for all the topics we're going to talk about. I think that'll be a great way to get started.
Well, I've been involved professionally in animal welfare and environmentalism for 30 years now, since I joined Compassion in World Farming as a campaigns assistant. I've since gone on to do other things and come back to Compassion to be its global chief executive. But my love of nature, if you like, and the natural world and animals really started when I was a very small boy. And it was my mum who really inspired me to look after animals, to treat ladybugs well, bees, look after them because they look after us, all of those kind of things. I would feed the birds in my grandfather's garden. And I remember how fascinated I was at the similarities between animals, including birds, and people. And I remember as a small child, I saw a sparrow, a female sparrow, pick up a little white pebble, which I think she thought was a piece of bread, a piece of white bread. And I remember seeing her put it down, and I ran out there to touch that pebble because I wanted to know if her beak, her bill, had saliva in it, like our mouths. And so this kinship that I felt with the natural world and with animals is something that has been with me from an early age. And now it's an all-consuming passion. It's what I spend every waking hour doing, writing, campaigning, lobbying, going out photographing and observing that natural world and the animals within it. Because I believe that a decent future for animals requires us to treat them well, and that a decent future for people requires us to treat animals well too. Really, protecting people is about protecting animals into the future.
Absolutely, completely agree, especially as we are just one of 10 million species on this planet. So yeah, wonderful introduction, and thank you for that. Phil, one of the things I definitely like as sort of a next step, if you could sort of take us on a little journey into the background of CIWF, a little bit about sort of its founders, its supporters, sort of who sets the priorities on a daily basis? And second to that, if you wouldn't mind, just for a couple of minutes, we were talking before the show. I sit here in a sort of a major metropolitan area on the East Coast of the United States, but about 3 miles east of here is the state of New Jersey, also known as the United States Garden State, which is home to many small family farms, but also some very large industrial size organizations. Could you take us just for a few minutes on sort of a general definition into sort of what factory farming constitutes and sort of where family farming ends and where it transitions into what we think of or might see at a distance as a factory, an agricultural factory?
Well, I think that to begin that journey, we should start with the journey of compassion in world farming, because the organization, which now has offices and personnel in 12 countries on 4 continents, including the US. Our executive director, Rachel Dreskin, is based in New York. We're also in China, in South Africa, and various European countries. Our headquarters that I'm based in is in England, in the UK. We were founded way back in the 60s, in 1967, by a dairy farmer by the name of Peter Roberts. And he kept his animals on pasture. He had chickens too, and they were free ranging with the cattle. But he became increasingly concerned at the rise of factory farming, which I would describe in a postage stamp as being the grain feeding of confined animals. So you're taking cattle, for example, off of their natural habitat. They are adapted with their 4 stomachs to eat grass and turn stuff which we can't eat, grass and forage, into things we can, meat and milk. Similarly with those hens on Peter's farm, they would be foraging, they'd be looking for their own dinner, they'd also be eating scraps and food waste. They are, along with pigs, nature's great recyclers. But instead we've taken them out of the fields, out of the woodlands, we put them into these factory farms where they're caged, crammed and confined, and we feed them grain. We feed them a lot of grain. So cereals, soya, palm kernel, even fish actually. So, broadening the definition of the feed, even ground up fish. And to give you a sense of how big a problem this is in people terms, there is now an area of cropland worldwide that if you put it all together, it would be covering a land surface half the size of the entire United States of America. That is the cropland growing animal feed. To put it another way, if that cropland wasn't feeding factory farmed animals who waste the vast majority of the food value in terms of calories and protein in conversion to meat, milk and eggs, if we use that cropland to feed people, we could feed an extra 4 billion people on the planet or more. So that's not to say that 4 billion people all at once would be a great idea, because it wouldn't. It'd be an environmental disaster. 4 billion extra people. It's to say that actually we can feed everyone on the planet well, something we're failing to do at the moment, with less farmland, not more. So factory farming holds us back from feeding people. And it's also the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet. Animals denied their very basic freedoms to express natural behaviors. Hens in cages so small they can't stretch their wings. Pigs, mother pigs, kept in crates so narrow they can't turn around for weeks or months at a time, made to face the wall. Cattle taken off those pastures that we've described and put into mega dairies or into feedlots where they're fed grain instead of grass. So that is the progression of factory farming, and that hints at the problem. Cruelty, huge resource waste, including the very thing it's meant to produce, food. Factory farming doesn't make food, it wastes it.
One of the themes, well, actually, 2 themes that we've touched on, which I think very interestingly have connections, not just to factory farming, but some of these some parallels to sort of this concept of a wet market, wildlife markets that we've seen with the recent COVID pandemic. These two themes we see are zoonotic diseases, or these novel organisms that we just don't see because we're not normally near these types of species, but also this emerging, or this problem that's been emerging, of course, antibiotic resistance, where we have literally millions of these infections now a year. We have something like in the United States, 35,000 deaths, something like 750,000 worldwide, a big problem. Could you talk a little bit about the connection of both novel zoonotic diseases as well as antibiotic resistant organisms that are unfortunately connected not just to the wet market theme that we hear about in the news lately, but also to factory farming?
Absolutely. Well, wet markets are essentially fresh meat markets, and often in certain parts of the world, the meat is so fresh that the animals are still live. They can be wild animals. Most of them actually are domesticated animals, chickens, for example, that'll be killed in front of you. I've seen this in Taiwan and other countries. So those are the wet markets. But I think that the bigger story is the fact that factory farming, that caged, crammed and confined environment for animals, where you can get thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of animals crammed into a confined space, that provides the perfect breeding ground for disease, for novel and new and more deadly strains of virus to emerge. So this isn't far-fetched. This is actually happening. If you think about highly pathogenic strains of avian influenza that have jumped the species barrier and can sicken and kill people. But I think the biggest example just 10 years ago from the Americas region is swine flu. Swine flu that depending on where you put the pin in the ground, either came out of the factory farms, the hog farms of North America, of the United States, or Mexico. Certainly, what we do know is that ground zero for swine flu was a little town called La Gloria in Mexico, where the first human case of this deadly disease was found, and it went on to kill about 500,000 people worldwide. It just didn't make the headlines in quite the same way as COVID. COVID is awful. It's a terrible, terrible disease. It shows how pandemics can snatch away the freedoms and the way of life that we all value in an instant. So the take-home message here is that factory farms are they're growing. They're getting more predominant. I would say they're getting worse, and they're producing this perfect breeding ground for the pandemic of the future. So we better take the COVID-19 not as a warning, but as a demonstration of what pandemics can do. And then you've mentioned the other dimension to this, which is that putting lots of animals into a small space not only creates the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of these new and more deadly viruses, but it also means that animals get sickened, and to keep them from essentially becoming ill or dying from the inevitable diseases of factory farming, of being kept in cramped, filthy conditions, we feed them a lot of antibiotics. In America, 80% of all antibiotics are fed to farmed animals. No wonder that we are seeing the rise of disease-resistant superbugs. In the world, when compassion in world farming, when I and my colleagues started to raise this issue in Europe 10 years ago, the world was feeding half of all its antibiotics to farmed animals. We've achieved getting this issue on the public policy agenda, certainly in Europe, and I would like to think elsewhere. We've made a breakthrough in Europe where the European Union has agreed to ban the routine use of precautionary antibiotics in farming from 2022, which is a major step forward to preserving antibiotics for the future. But sadly, globally, the amount of antibiotics we're feeding to animals worldwide has gone up to 73%. So worldwide, it's nearly as high as it is in the United States of America. No wonder then that the World Health Organization tells us that if we don't do something, if we don't move away from our current trajectory, then we're heading towards a post-antibiotic era where currently treatable diseases could once again kill. Now, let me put that into context. We've seen COVID-19, a virus, going rampant around the world and killing, to date, more than 1 million people. Awful, awful, awful. We know the impact on all our lives. Antibiotic resistance, which is dealing with disease-resistant bacteria, if we get to that place of a post-antibiotic era, then estimates put it that 10 million people a year could die needlessly as a result. This is why we have to take seriously the mantra that if we're going to protect people, our families, our communities, our countries, we've got to protect animals too and end factory farming. Moving
from sort of one existential risk of pandemics and a post-antibiotic era to another major one, of course, climate change and biodiversity loss. I saw this rather staggering figure that in 2019 alone, we lost an acre of primary forest, which is about the size of a football field, every 6 seconds. And of course, we've had the really explosive growth of this industrialized agriculture and things like cattle farming in places like Brazil, where we also have the Amazon and the lungs of the earth, and we're chopping that down so they can graze the cattle and grow more soybeans and have this vicious cycle while we're destroying what Mother Nature has been creating for, has kept for hundreds of millions of years. Talk to us a little bit about the connection in terms of this industrialized agriculture and the real danger of destroying this biodiversity that not only provides us with medicines and food and so forth, but, you know, keeps a lot of that carbon out of the air. Take us on a little journey there, if you would.
Yeah. Well, the threat is real. The threat of devastation of the life support system for humanity is a real one. The livestock sector in totality produces as much greenhouse gases as all the exhaust fumes of the world's planes, trains and cars put together. Amazing. It's that serious. And at the same time, we've talked about factory farming being the biggest cruelty, the biggest cause of cruelty on the planet. It's also a major driver of wildlife declines. It's a major driver of the destruction of habitats. Why is that? It's because as factory farming expands, what it does is it pushes into wild lands for new crop fields. It pushes cattle further into the forests for more pasture. And one of the big instances of this can be seen in South America, in Brazil and Argentina, where vast acreages of land are already growing crops, principally soya, corn and other animal feeds. Those acreages are expanding. But what people don't realize so often, particularly people that are just peering into this issue in a moment, is that people latch onto the devastation done by the cattle in the Amazon and the deforestation that goes on to create those new cattle pastures. But what is overlooked, because it's quite hidden, is what has driven the cattle into the forest. Well, it is quite often that the existing cattle pastures in places like the Cerrado, the Midwest wooded savanna of Brazil, places like the existing cattle pastures are being ploughed up because it's flat land. It's cultivatable, easily cultivatable land. It's being ploughed up by big companies to produce animal feed for factory farmed animals. What that does is that demand for that land, fueled by the demand for factory farming worldwide and for feed for factory farmed animals, it pushes up the land prices. So it means that the cattle farmers on that existing pasture that's about to get plowed up, they get all of their paydays come at once, all their Christmases at once. They get a big payout, which means they can take that money and buy much more land in the rainforest, in the Amazon, and in what scientists call a land use cascade. So what is happening is factory farming, the production of feed, soya for factory farms, is displacing the cattle into the forest and amplifying the destruction. Scientists suggest that if we were to reduce expansion of soya production in South America by 10%, it would have a consequential reduction of deforestation in the Amazon of 40%. That is the land use cascade, the amplification effect of cheap meat from factory farmed animals and the feed that sustains the system.
Philip, coming to, obviously we mentioned the topic of compassion, and you've talked about the dreadful conditions within the feeding sort of dynamic and growing the animals and so forth. But I was looking at this some of this data from the USDA yesterday, where at the end of the day, unfortunately, every year when you add up the chickens and the pigs and the cattle and the turkeys and so forth, it's 80+ billion land animals alone, and the fish, that are slaughtered every year. And it's a staggering number when you put it in context. We did a show on murders, which it's a drop in the bucket compared to these numbers in terms of humans compared to animals. I'm just interested in, obviously, with the exception of going vegan, animals are going to be slaughtered at some point. What are some? I apologize if this is a childish question, but are there alternatives? Are there some compassionate aspects of slaughtering it? Because I remember early on, is sort of in the definition of CIWF, you talk about not all slaughtering techniques. Are there compassionate slaughtering techniques that are used, and what can you sort of tell us what's acceptable, what's not, and when we're dealing with 80 billion animals? It's hard to wrap your mind around it, but take us a little bit in that direction, if you would.
Yeah, no, it is mind-boggling. Yeah, for every billion people on the planet, comes with 10 billion animals reared and slaughtered every year for meat and other animal products, and that's a serious issue, especially when 2/3 of them are on factory farms. So, to start with the basic consumer message, what can we all do about the planetary destruction and the cruelty? I would say let's eat more plants, less meat, milk, and eggs, making sure that any meat, milk, and eggs we do eat comes from animals that have been given a decent life. So pasture-fed, free-range, organic. These are the kinds of things we're looking for. And the new buzzword is regenerative. And Compassion in World Farming is on the board of a new regenerative organic certification, giving animals decent lives in a way which preserves the future for people. But to answer your question about can animals be slaughtered humanely, well, there are ways which reduce the suffering, making sure that animals are stunned into unconsciousness immediately using various techniques, captive bolt or electrocution techniques. The downside is that as animal agriculture has gotten so big and the line speeds, the number of animals being killed in a slaughterhouse are increasing, the throughput is increasing, then the margin for error gets bigger. More animals going through an automated stunning system, chickens in this instance, more animals are going to get missed or misstunned, so that they're basically tortured rather than stunned. And we've also got a hideous thing that's been going on in some cases with some animal welfareists advocating for it, which is now that pigs are being stunned, so they call, using high levels of carbon dioxide gas, which is the most hideous way of killing any animal. It doesn't stun them. It tortures them for up to a minute before they lose consciousness. And to actually give you a word picture of that, what the carbon dioxide does is that it oxidizes in the wet parts of the animal. It acidifies. And so it makes the animals burn in their lungs, in their eyes, in their nose. They're burning from the inside out in terror and in pain for up to 60 seconds or more before they lose consciousness. And this was believed, in my view, totally erroneously by some animal welfareists to be better than the alternatives. And my goodness, if that is better than the alternatives, I would hate to see what they were doing before.
Looking forward, obviously, we have this growing population. Mentioned some of the simpler things that we can be doing in terms of the choices we make. I'd like to sort of just touch on a few of sort of the sort of technological things that we've talked about on the show in the past. I'd just like to get your view. One of the areas that it's not cost effective yet, but it's being experimented with is this principle of laboratory grown meat, which we're not there yet. So we've gotten pretty good at making $100,000 hamburgers and $25,000 pieces of sushi, but here are potential methods in the laboratory where potentially one day, I don't know if it's 10 years, 50 years, whatever, that we can create laboratory grown meats cost effectively. What are your thoughts on a theme like that at CIWF?
For compassion and well farming, we see a big future for what I would broadly term modern foods. Okay. So lab meat, cultured meats, and meat produced from stem cells rather than from live animals, I think is a big part of the solution. And one of the characteristics of compassion and well farming, we're not an organization that's saying there is one solution. Mm-hmm. We're not saying the world should go vegan. We're not saying that only regenerative agriculture is the way forward. We're not saying that only cultured meat is the way forward. What we are saying is that all of those things and more are the way forward. What we need to do is get animals out of factory farms, reduce the number of animals that we are producing, live living animals, by more than half worldwide if we're going to get our ecosystem back into balance. And to your point, I think cultured meat from stem cells gives us the way of providing people with the meat experience that they are looking for. Because despite the rise of vegan and the embrace of society with vegan, entirely plant-based food products, the reality is that all the statistics show that people in America, in Europe, and worldwide are eating more meat per capita, per person now than ever before. So, meat is still something which people want. And so cultured meat gives us a win-win-win. It gives us an ability to give people the meat that they want without killing the animals and in a much more environmentally friendly way. It has vastly reduced greenhouse gas emissions, vastly reduced land use footprint, and vastly reduced water use too. So I do see it as a big part of the future. And there are other technologies in this bag of modern foods coming through as well. Precision fermentation, the ability to program bacteria and fungi to produce specific food molecules, building blocks of food, of proteins, if you like, gives us the ability to produce proteins at a fraction of the cost of current agriculture. So what this also gives us is the ability to produce the growing medium, because the idea of stem cells, one of the things which is holding back the growth of cultured meat, lab meat, is that the growing medium for growing these stem cells at scale is very, very expensive to produce. But precision fermentation can not only produce dirt cheap proteins, it can also produce at scale very, very cost effective growing media for cultured meat. So those two will feed off each other. The other thing which we're seeing is plant-based alternatives, burgers made only of plants that taste increasingly like real meat. Look at Beyond Meat or the Impossible Burger. Pat Brown talks about the unlike cattle, we're getting better at producing meat every day with these burgers. One of the things which holds them back is, at the moment, they're quite expensive compared with meat. However, when precision fermentation takes off, it will produce the protein isolates, the building blocks for these plant-based foods at a fraction of the cost. On the cultured meat, it will produce the growing medium at a fraction of the cost. It will also open up the whole alternative protein panoply. So the technologies will feed off each other. And there we can see that what it opens up is a future where factory farming that has existed for 70 years, propped up by economic domination, producing cheap meat, you can see that factory farming actually could collapse by that same double-edged sword of economics. Why? Because factory farming is about big scale, low margin. It's about producing chicken or beef in great volumes, but at very low profit margins. So when a protein that can compete on taste and experience, your texture experience, when a protein comes along that can compete with a factory farmed chicken or beef, then you can see that the business case for producing animals at this higher cost in stinky, unhealthy, environmentally destructive conditions will fall away overnight. And what the real irony here is that factory farming is propped up by anonymity, by a lack of clear labeling. You don't go into the meat store and see this was produced using factory farming, this was intensively produced. What you see is this is fresh or farm fresh or natural. Well, that cheap anonymity and some might say dishonesty in the labeling that has made factory farm products, be they frozen burgers or sausages, such a sales thing. The price-beating cheapness of cultured meat and plant-based alternatives, precision fermentation alternatives into the future will strip away the market for that cheap, anonymous factory farmed meat, and factory farming will go out of business. It will collapse. It will no longer make any sense at all in this time scale of a couple of decades.
Philip, at the beginning, I was talking about obviously your bio and that you've become such an influential figure in this industry, and you've been 800 food companies worldwide that you've worked with that had impacted. Obviously, you've met a lot of fascinating people, not just in industry, but obviously in government, academia. Take us out just a little bit on some of the important influencers and mentors across your career that have really inspired you and kept you on this path. Any specific people that you might want to mention, shout out to at this part of the show? Please take the floor.
Well, I think the person that has influenced me the greatest has been the founder of Compassion in World Farming, Peter Roberts. Yeah, he took a chance on me 30 years ago, gave me a job. I didn't have much experience in the field. I just had enthusiasm. He took me under his wing and he taught me well. In fact, my book, Farmageddon, The True Cost of Cheap Meat, was the book that I thought he would write. That was his book, really, embedded in my mind and, through my fingertips into my computers. So he was very much a huge mentor for me. And, beyond that, I think I'm inspired by ordinary people doing fantastic things for animals and for the environment. I'm inspired by Greta Thunberg and what she's doing in sparking a real presence around the climate emergency. I'm inspired by, it may not translate in the US so well, but Sir David Attenborough,
Sure.
the globally renowned naturalist. He inspires me every day. And in fact, I embedded him in the foreword of my second book, Dead Zone, Where the Wild Things Were. So, but beyond that, I meet so many people, ordinary people that are doing extraordinary things for animals. And that's what keeps me going, really, the fact that we're not alone. We are a growing movement, ever more influential, being taken ever more seriously, which we need to do because we are now entering an age of climate, nature, and health emergency. Future pandemics, the collapse of our natural ecosystem, and the warming of our world means things are going to have to change. This temporary situation around COVID has become less temporary. It's becoming a bit of a way of life. Well, actually, things could get so much worse if we don't heed this demonstration from nature of what could happen if we don't work in harmony with nature.
Wonderful message. Wonderful wrap up the message. Thank you for that. Really inspiring, Philip, and wishing you the best with everything you're doing and moving forward. Just really inspiring story, and hopefully we're going to see major change as you've been directing it. For everybody that's going to be watching on this YouTube episode or listening on the various podcast networks, you've been listening to Philip Lymbery, Chief Executive Officer, Compassion in World Farming. Pick up his books, Farmageddon, The True Cost of Cheap Meat, and Dead Zone, Where the Wild Things Were. Philip, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule today. Thank you for everything you do. And as we say on the show, thank you for moving the human story forward, but thank you for moving the animal story forward for those 80 billion plus every year. That it's been really eye-opening, inspiring, and it's just really a great time meeting you.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.